But it's just a fascinating retrospective to see where we've come from as we go along. With apologies to Moody Blues, by the way, for the opening screen. Okay. And it does work, right? Hang on. Something going on with that? Now it's plugged in, yes? Yeah. Yeah, it's not doing it. You know, the batteries. There's the door now.
Is this the second one that was at the artist's house yesterday?
No, this is my own personal one. Okay, a little laser works, so I'll just use that and hit the space bar as I need to. Oh, you can do that one? Okay, with the mouse? Yeah, that's fine. Okay, there we go. Good. Terrific.
Left click.
Yep, okay. Where was I? Oh yeah, so retrospective, because the 20th century had a lot of amazing events along the way related to astronomy and space exploration, as Rich alluded to already just moments ago. We had some amazing technological failures with that mouse. But anyway, we had some really amazing events along the way. Astronauts walking on the moon, needless to say, probably the culmination of that in 1969. We go on with, I'm hitting the space bar, okay. There we go. And we had some terrible disasters as well, certainly with the explosion of the Challenger in 1986. Amazing discoveries with the launch and then subsequent repair of the Hubble Space Telescope. Literally rewrote astronomy, rewrote the science. I think one of the most amazing discoveries, though, with Hubble had to be this one here. Hubble telescope takes photo of heaven, incredible image beamed to NASA on December 26th. Pope John Paul II was amazed by the discovery, according to the World News Report. Remember the World News Report? Boy, do I miss that. That was my source of scientific information. But I'd like to take you back in time now, all the way to the year 1900, because as I say, astronomy, amateur astronomy and amateur astronomers were significantly different than the mix that we have today. If you're an amateur astronomer in the year 1900, you probably subscribed to Popular Astronomy magazine. Popular Astronomy was really the only substantial English language magazine, certainly here in the US. And as you can see on the screen, right over here, if you can see the laser pointer, it says plainly worded and largely untechnical in language, amply illustrated. Largely untechnical in language. Such as you open up the magazine a couple of pages later, and here was some of the non-technical language that would bring back various differential equation nightmares and that sort of things. I'm not too sure how non-technical it really was. But if you really did want non-technical, then you would turn to not magazine like Popular Astronomy so much as you would books written by this gentleman. His name is Garrett Serviss. Anybody know Garrett Serviss? Amazing, amazing author. He was a newspaper writer by trade, but he had a number of books on astronomy for amateur astronomers, for backyard astronomers. He also dabbled in science fiction writing as well. Pleasures of the Telescope, for instance, is one that I go to routinely if I'm looking to see what the view was of amateur astronomers a century ago. If I'm doing my articles or whatever, I like to kind of put in some historical perspective as well. So I turned a page to this, and he had very interesting commentary about not what to see with a telescope, but rather how to purchase a telescope in the early 20th century. Because it was typically a custom affair. This paragraph reads in part, there is only one way in which you can be sure of getting a good telescope. First decide how large a glass you are to have, and then go to a maker of established reputation, fix upon the price you are willing to pay, remembering that good work is never cheap. and finally see that the instrument furnished to you answers the proper tests for a telescope of its size. There are telescopes and there are telescopes. Well, that's true certainly today as well. We see there are some really great telescopes and there are some, somewhat less great telescopes, I'll say. So in that sense, that really hasn't changed. But the thing is, it was a custom-made affair. So therefore, they were pretty expensive, needless to say. People's interest in astronomy and the idea of getting a telescope really started to bloom when along comes Halley's Comet, first approach in 1910. Because now suddenly Halley mania gripped the nation, gripped, if not the entire world. Okay? All of a sudden, people were trying to view, look at this, Fifth Avenue and Broadway in Gary, Indiana on May 20th, 1910. The photo that you have over there, supposedly a photo you have over there of Halley's Comet across the sky. Well, now we start to see more common advertisements for telescopes. Instead of having to fix upon a price from a reputable builder, now you had companies like Broadhurst, Clarkson and Company come into it. Well, they weren't in the US, they were over in London. So if you wanted to buy a telescope, you might have to ship it across the pond from the mother country to get it here. So that was expensive just on its own, of course. But the common thread, they were all refractors. No matter where you looked, if you wanted to buy a telescope for the amateur astronomer, you were buying refractors. And they were expensive, needless to say. But things started to change, important changes started to come along with Stellafane. This was really where amateur astronomers and the popular idea that amateur astronomers could be anybody, thanks to the brilliance of Stellafane and Russell W. Porter. Because suddenly he showed how you can't afford a telescope, no worries, you can make one for yourself. And so that was, you have no idea, you're here today because of this. I'm here today because of this. We all are. Because that literally reinvented the hobby for all of us in this room, was Russell Porter. Here you can see the original Stellafane convention in the lower left-hand corner, the weekend of July 4th, 1926, the first Stellafane convention. Had what, a dozen people or something like that? I love the cook. You see in the door over here going into the pink clubhouse, right? I like the cook with the hat. That's kind of a nice touch. And everybody wearing ties. Not t-shirts, but ties. So I think that's kind of cool also. James Harden, James Harden gave birth to the idea of astronomy and telescope making to Russell Porter. The Harkness house, as Rich was talking about earlier as well. So he, in some sense, was really a pivotal character in the story of Stellafane. And we start to see ads now in magazines like Popular Astronomy. Now, or this was Scientific American, books, How to Make Your Own Telescope, Amateur Telescope Making, was published. Again, a huge step forward in the hobby of astronomy. Suddenly now telescopes were affordable. You could buy the equipment that you need to make a mirror, and you build a telescope based on the instructions that you received. Well, Albert Ingalls, who worked for Scientific American, visited Stellafane, and he wrote an article that appeared in the magazine. And suddenly that caught everybody's attention across the country. So it was really Albert Ingalls who got everybody across the country aware of Stellafane. And so he met with Porter up here routinely. I love one of the first telescopes that you see over here on the right-hand side. Look at that eyepiece. It just goes forever. I'm not sure what that is. Not a Nagler, I know that much, but that's an eyepiece. But then also, Porter realized that maybe there's a market for some of this, so he started to make very limited numbers. The Garden telescope. Everybody familiar with those? The Porter Garden telescope? There were some have been on display here. Whether or not they will be tomorrow, I don't know. But they're works of art. Really, they're works of art as much as they are optical instruments. Just an amazing construction. Well, we go from the 1920s into the 1930s, and of course with the discovery of Pluto, thanks to Clyde Tombaugh, another amateur astronomer who made his own telescope. You can see Tombaugh over there on the lower right-hand corner. I love the headline that appears in the New York Times, ninth planet discovered on the edge of the solar system, first found in 84 years. And of course it went on to say how it's 8,000 miles in diameter or more. Okay, that was a bit overstated, I suppose. So first Pluto appeared to be huge, as large as the Earth. But of course it was downsized, as so many things were, and so now we have Pluto's a little puny rock floating around, a fascinating object to say the least. But it's not so much a planet as it is a dwarf planet these days. But the idea of Pluto being discovered also captured the imagination and the attention of the average person. At the same time, interest in astronomy started to grow, as Rich mentioned also, with more and more planetariums coming into it. We have the Untitled Planetarium in Chicago. We have the Hayden Planetarium in New York City as well. Now the Hayden, which Rich mentioned before, I worked at the Hayden in the city, New York City, from 1979 to 1981. First I got out of college. I worked there for a couple of years. And the history of that place is a whole afternoon presentation on its own. The first director of the Hayden Planetarium was this gentleman that you see standing in front of the projector. His name is Clyde Fisher, And Clyde Fisher also was a real visionary because he saw the potential of his brand new institution, a wing of the American Museum of Natural History. He began to publish a monthly newsletter called The Drama of the Skies. Lasted only 12 months, The Drama of the Skies, until it evolved into the larger formatted The Sky. The beginning of the birth that would ultimately lead to Sky and Telescope. Okay. So that came out, and that ran for several years, and I have several of the copies at home, including, this is volume number 1. I love that graphic. You have the Earth, and you have Saturn right over there, and some other stuff, and all these clouds floating around between the planets, and oh well, can't have everything. But this is a great one. This is one of the issues, because they try to gear the articles not just for the technical, but rather more for the backyard astronomer and things that people could do or see, or in this case, photograph. And it was written by Charles Cole. He was the staff photographer at the Museum of Natural History, shooting in the dark. And take a look at some of this equipment. I know you and we have cameras just like that, right? That we're going to shoot the sky tonight with this bellows like that. And look, I love this one over here, this Kodak Brownie. And look how it's aimed at the sky on a rock. Great stuff. That's terrific. But it caught the imagination of people. But at the same time in the sky, you start to see more and more ads for amateur telescope making supplies. Okay? We have here Corning Glassworks, J.W. Fecker in Pittsburgh, a name that familiar to probably most of you, making high-end telescopes, but also aiming some toward the amateur as well. And we had completely made telescopes. Look at this. We have the Astronoset, $25. $25 for a complete refractor. Okay. Well, okay, that's in 1920s money. Today, that would run you $533. Okay. So astronomy was still, if you were buying a telescope, was still for the high-end part of the population in terms of budget. It was still very expensive, which is why, of course, amateur telescope making was so popular. At about the same time, roughly, you had the Telescope periodical appear at Harvard in Cambridge. Well, eventually, the two of them came together. Whoops, sorry. That was such a great effect, I got to do it again. The two of them came together, and Sky and Telescope was born in the early 1940s. This issue is, November 1941. November 1941. Sky and Telescope was born. And that was a monumental push forward for the amateur astronomer. Now the availability, no differential equations necessary, amply illustrated, and they really meant at that time. And it was really a renaissance moment for the amateur astronomer in the 1940s. It had many of the things that we come to expect today. The monthly star map, of course, what's going on in the nighttime sky in November. Many of these features were written by a gentleman named Leland Copeland. Leland Copeland, one of the premier astronomy authors in the mid part of the 20th century. He also had a small column, where'd my pointer go? Here. At the very bottom of this page, can you see it says Deep Sky Wonders? He was the first person to write that column, Deep Sky Wonders, in the magazine. And it ran for several years until it was moved over to this guy from Kansas named Walter Scott Houston. And he took it over. The first three objects that Walter Scott Houston wrote about in Sky and Telescope in Deep Sky Wonders was M57, M27, and M11. Those were the first three objects, in the first Walter Scott Houston penned Deep Sky Wonders. I call it Scotty's Triangle, and that's it in the summertime sky. Now, for those who happen to read, if you read my column that I do every month in Astronomy Magazine, take a look at the June issue. I dedicated that column to Walter Scott Houston because it was his 110th birthday back on May 30th, I think it was. And so I thought it was my duty, really, as a Scotty disciple, to talk about him, because there's so many people who are coming up today who don't know where we came from either. And Walter Scott Houston was just, I don't know about you, but for me, he was just a huge part of my early life, huge part. And when I met him up here and played Frisbee with him in the old field, okay, back in 1975, well, I was just playing Frisbee with God himself. I mean, it was just such an emotional moment for me. And he was actually pretty good also. So that was nice. And Rich Sanderson took this picture of me with Scotty in 1991, I think that picture was. Yeah, because we have the Eclipse shirt on, right? Yeah, that was 1991. Because my first book came out, Touring the Universe Through Binoculars, in November 1990. And he wrote a very kind review of it in his column back then. So I want to thank him for it. But I would really encourage you to look for Scotty's Triangle tonight with your binoculars or telescope. Again, it's M57, M27, and M11. And I think we as amateur astronomers should honor those who came up before us. I think we should be referring to that as Scotty's Triangle, because I think it's a nice celestial memorial to honor his memory. But anyway, that's me talking. World War II comes along in the 40s, and of course that divides things. After World War II, suddenly we had all this surplus military material, war surplus material left over. Lenses and other optics and all kinds of mechanical gizmos and this and that. So World War II, literally post-World War II, a huge turning point for amateur astronomy because of the availability of all this war surplus stuff. And the ads in the magazine, Sky and Telescope, the ads reflected that, because you had page after page of equipment for amateur telescope makers. From Edmund Salvage Company, later known as Edmund Scientific. They went from salvage to scientific, which I think is an interesting leap. We had A. Jagers or A. Jaegers. Is it Jaegers or Jagers? I don't know. Anyway, something like that. Over in Lynbrook, Long Island, Nassau County, just outside New York City. Harry Ross was another one. West Broadway in New York, New York. And you had a few others along the way. One, Tinsley was a popular name. C.C. Young was another popular name where you could buy supplies and so forth and so on. There's also an ad, the third down on the right-hand side, says Skyscope. That was a telescope aimed more for young astronomers. We also had a refractor. They were focused mostly on reflectors back in the day, but now refractors, such as from Brandon Scientific Development Company in Malvern, New York, came along. And yes, that is pointing in the correct direction, by the way. I always thought that was upside down, or pointing down to the ground instead of up. No, that was correctly oriented, kind of an interesting design. $265 for a refractor. Back then, today, of course, it's $3,214. So you think you spent a lot of money for your telescopes today? You got nothing to complain about by comparison. Here's the Skyscope that I mentioned before. Again, aimed at beginning astronomers, kids, right, into teenagers and so forth and so on. Only $44.75. Or in today's $543 for that. A little 3.5-inch reflector on a relatively flimsy looking mount, but that was the Skyscope. Anybody own one of those, by the way, or familiar with those? They got a lot of people, maybe 10 years older than I am, a lot of people involved with it. Yeah, Dennis? Yeah, do you have one? Did you really? Yeah. How flimsy was that mount? It was given to you. I was afraid of that. Okay. Just had that sense. Into the 50s we go, halfway through the century, and of course now Sputnik, the space age, has arrived. Reflectors ruled. A couple of shots from an early Stellafane in the 50s. Reflectors ruled. Okay? Some large, some small, all on equatorial mounts of one sort or another, commonly German equatorial mounts. But there were more and more already made telescopes aimed for the amateur astronomer. And again, Edmund was leading the role, certainly in that. We had the 3-inch reflector at the top left-hand corner, for instance, the Space Conqueror it was called. We had the Deluxe Space Conqueror as a 4¼ inch reflector, and so forth. We had an M73 powered telescope, only $7.50. A $75 value. Ooh, boy, how can they afford to do that? Different eyepieces and so forth over here. There's the Spitz Moon Scope at the top, which I think is kind of a cool design. Not that I've ever seen it, but it looks like an interesting design. As we get into the 50s more, as I mentioned, we have larger telescopes from Edmund coming along. The Space Conqueror, only $29.95. For many of us, it was our first telescope. Right, Al? That's right. Yeah, first telescope, I remember that. But nowadays it goes for $334.89. So when you think about it, and I putting this together when I'm doing the cost for inflation, I realize just how much our parents spent on these telescopes for us. You know, that's pretty good when you think about it, right? That's you know, kind of got to me here thinking about it a little bit. This is the one I wanted, the Palomar Junior. Okay, 4¼ inch. That was the telescope. I lusted over this telescope in high school. I really did. And it went for $74.50. But in reality, today that's $812. So I could understand why my parents didn't buy it probably, because it was either that or eat for a month. And you know, so there we are. Other telescopes start to appear though. Astrolite telescopes, Cave Optical. How many of you are familiar with Cave Optical? Tom Cave, right? Great name. Tom Cave, of course, an amateur astronomer who started to market these things. He was a great Mars observer. That was his thing, was Mars for Alpo, was his big thing. So we have Cave Optical now suddenly marketing Cassegrain reflectors as well. And I love the storefront photo on the right-hand side over there. I'm not too sure if that was his Corvette or not, but I did understand that he did own a Corvette, somebody told me, so I almost bet you that had to be his car. The 4-inch Dinoscope. Anybody know the name Dinoscope? That was the telescope. That was the Volkswagen Beetle of telescopes, was the Dinoscope by Criterion Manufacturing Company in Hartford, downtown Hartford. The first one they started to market was this one over here, $44.95. A 4-inch, I think it was F10, if I remember correctly. Then they upped the game a little bit to the custom Dinoscopes. They were intended to be bolted down to a surface, concrete pier of some sort, concrete pad, you bolt a pier onto it, but inside the pier itself was a tripod that you could pull out, and the whole telescope with the tripod legs inside here, the tripod would look like that on the right-hand side, you could pull it out and walk away with it and set up someplace else. Okay? Anybody ever own one of those? They weigh a ton, because my middle school in Norwalk, Connecticut, where I grew up, had one. And I'd have to hump that thing around every now and then. Oh my gosh. No wonder I have a bad back today, because when I was 12 years old, I was abused, and because I had to carry that thing all over the place. Enjoy the extra thrills of a superb 6-inch at the price of a 4-inch, the RV6 Dinoscope. That was the Volkswagen Beetle. Okay? That was a telescope that I just wanted that in the worst way. And my best friend at the time, Al Papson, who's right over there, and I don't want to sing down, but he had one. And I'm like, I wanted one of those, but my parents couldn't afford it. So they got me a 4-inch reflector from Lafayette Radio. Well, okay, that was just, an embarrassment. But a 6-inch, like, holy cow. I wanted that, only $194.95, and it was $194.95 for years and years and years and years and years. Today, that's $1,925.10. Okay, if you go from 1950s into 2022. Astonishing. Refractors started to make a bit of a comeback with Unitron, or United Trading Company as they were known at first, and then they condensed that to Unitron in Boston. Then they moved to Plainview, New York, and they've kind of bounced around. They're really out of the telescope game now. They make mostly medical microscopes, apparently. They're still around, to the best of my knowledge. But you could get a 1.6-inch refractor for $75. You get a 2.4-inch equatorial for $225. And so outstanding optics for a long focus achromatic refractor, certainly. And they kept getting bigger as time went on. I'm not too, she's trying to decide on the left-hand side there, which telescope should I get, I guess. And I love the picture on the right-hand side. Very stately looking telescope. Another great one from the 50s, the Celeste Star. Not to be confused with Celestron. They're still years in the future here. The Celeste Star. We'll see those on display every now and then up here. Amazing instruments. Amazing instruments. Celeste Stars were a fine telescope, as it says. On the left-hand side, $195, and the bigger ones over on the right were somewhat more, up to $495 for the bottom one, a 6-inch. But really interesting designs, fascinating type mount, and it really the mount itself sort of harkened to what was to come with Celestron some years later. But if you want a portable telescope, Questar was the way to go, certainly, and still today for many people that's the pinnacle of an amateur telescope is the Questar. Still looking today largely as they did when they were first introduced back in the 50s. Planetariums exploded with the space age, the 50s into the early 60s. As a matter of fact, it's my understanding that the National Science Foundation was so interested in getting planetariums into schools that they would match dollar for dollar whatever a planetarium system, whatever school system rather, would pay for a planetarium. So in other words, if the planetarium cost you X dollars, they would give you X dollars on top of it, so you come to the total installation price. They would pay 50% of the bill. That's why, at least at one point, there were 33 school planetariums in the borough of the Bronx, New York alone. 33 of them. They were in broom closets. They were literally all over the place. There was a beautiful planetarium at the Herbert Lehman High School in Co-op City, right off of 95, right off the Cross Bronx Expressway. Beautiful planetarium that was there. And he was the brainchild behind many of these Spitz planetariums. The first one he marketed, the Spitz Model A, with the famous dodecahedron star ball. They weren't round, they were these multi-sided dodecahedrons. Well, the name Spitz started to get more and more well-known in general society, and so Spitz Junior planetariums started to be marketed by this gentleman over here, Thomas Liversidge, I believe is how you pronounce it. He started to market these toy planetariums, if that's what you want to call them. How many of you have one of these? I did. In fact, I had a couple of them. How many of you had the dome that came with it? I did. Sears sold it. That was great. I had my own little planetarium in my own little basement until it fell and broke, but that's another story for another day. Moonwatch, we already talked about that, but just another shot of Moonwatch, and that's really a great example of citizen science going on right there, that you had people of all walks of life getting involved. So amazing movement, late 50s into the early 60s, but then of course the space race continued to heat up. Clubs, astronomy clubs, conventions started to grow all over the place. Star parties grew. Other companies came along as well, became more and more popular, like Jaegers, again, expanded. Both offerings in terms of complete telescopes. They had a 6-power elbow telescope over there. We just talked about that previously as well. But if you wanted to get an objective lens for a refractor that you were making, that was probably on a short list of suppliers to consider. Meanwhile, over on the West Coast, we had Valor Electronics coming into it. And they introduced a division of Valor Electronics called Celestron Pacific. Celestron Pacific, marketing their first telescopes for universities, professional observatories, and so on, such as the Celestronic 20. If you take a look at that, notice where you look through the eyepiece, coming right out the deck axis there, the declination axis. Kind of interesting, right, the design. Anybody ever see one of these in person? I never have. Okay, fascinating design, but I never did. But that was founded by Tom Johnson, who was an amateur telescope maker. So he turned his hobby into a job. So again, amateur astronomy making a huge impact on the hobby that we know and love today. He later came along with a smaller instrument called the Celestron 10 for $1,870 it went for. Here's an actual photograph of one that I don't think that was taken up here. No, it's not up here, but we've had a few displayed up here over the years with the blue that you see. Beautiful, beautiful color scheme. And it kept on going. We had the 20 that you saw previously. That went up to the 22, the Celestron 22, which is at the bottom left over here. and over here you can see it as well. This one is an interesting one. I don't think it was ever built. At least that's what I understand. It's an unobstructed Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope. Isn't that a strange design? The corrector plate's right over here. There's a flat mirror here, it bounces up over here and then out through the eyepiece like that. Somewhere in the middle of all that is a primary mirror. I'm not too sure exactly. Primary, I'm guessing, must have been happened to be here and had to be tilted to another flat or something. Maybe it was hyperbola, I'm not too sure, and then out through the eyepiece like so. I think it was on paper. I don't think it was ever produced. The Celestron 10 over here, I love the slide rule. Okay? But, you know, sign of the times, I guess. But take a look at it. I love the... What's that? Is that what they call it? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. I love this line over here. It no longer takes a $250,000 grant or federal aid to equip an observatory with a modern catadioptric telescope of large aperture. Well, if you take a look down over here, the Celestron 22 went for $24,000. Well, that's not $250,000, right? $24,000. Yeah, okay. That was then. Okay. Nowadays, $222,000. So still a true statement. Still not $250,000, but boy, is that getting awfully close. Give it another few weeks, and it'll be over it, just like that, because of our inflation. Okay, but that's a great line. The Dinoscope, still here, still $194.95. Into the 60s we go. But if you get into the mid 60s, 66, 67, that would have shot up to $1,800. That's what you pay for it today, for the exact same telescope. But they rolled out instead the RV8. Now, I got to tell you a story. 1970, I had my 4-inch reflector from Lafayette Radio. Okay, I wanted that RV6. My mom said, okay, we have a Christmas club. Okay, you can either get the RV6 for Christmas 1970, or you can wait another year and I'll save up enough money. We'll say, my dad and she, save up enough money to get you the RV8 for $399.95. Against my better nature, I waited, and I got the RV8. And that was a life-changing experience for me. It really was. What an amazing... Anybody own an RV8 or RV6? Yeah, I know, Scott, you did. Yeah. Great telescopes. Great. I mean, the optics were just second to none. But I now realize the sacrifice... come on, back, thank you. It cost them the equivalent today of $3,185. My parents were not rich. So, again, you know, that's what it meant to me. But here's my RV8 today. Okay, it's gone through a few color changes along the way. It was green, it was red. It's been red, white, and blue for the bicentennial. It's been a few other, it's currently yellow. I'm retiring at the end of this year, and one of my first retirement projects is to resurrect it to its original appearance with the white tube and maybe a little bit glossier than it was originally. And once I get that done, I'm going to bring it up here just to show people, because it meant so much to me. It's been up here before, but it hasn't been in the last many, many years. Amateur telescope makers still wowing everybody, certainly up here at Stellafane. Roger Tuthill with this scope, a 20-inch telescope, 1965. Of course, he went on, an amateur telescope maker, to turn it into a business as well. Again, bettering the life of amateur astronomers. We had Optical Craftsman, was another name that was very popular back into the 60s as well. I love that trailer-mounted reflector there. Refractors, Unitron was still there. You shouldn't be smoking a cigarette near the optics of that telescope there, bud. But in any case, you know, but he was big man on campus. Look at this guy. Hey, I'm cool. I have a telescope. And that was the market there. That's the dome I had out of the Sears Christmas catalog of 1970, I think 1970 maybe. I had that plus the projector you see there in the foreground. But again, astronomy clubs started to come all over the place. I grew up in Norwalk, Connecticut, and every Friday night, my dad would drive me to the Stanford Observatory in Stamford, Connecticut, where you had the this huge Gregory McSudoff telescope, 22-inch Gregory McSudoff telescope. And there was the Fairfield County Astronomical Society, and there was the Fairfield County Junior Astronomical Society. And I was a member of that. And here we are in one of our meetings. You like that? Yeah? That's him right over here, and that's me, the tall kid in the back, in the dark days when I thought I could actually part my hair. I gave up on that a long time ago. But that was us. And everybody else has faded away except me and Al. So we kind of stuck with this thing. Who knows where the other ones are? Into the 70s. The times they are a-changing. Unitron was still around, but the whole decade had a different look to it. And that really started in June of 1970 with the introduction of the Celestron 8. Tom Johnson was brilliant understanding the needs of the amateur astronomer. Everybody else was making these big long tube Newtonian reflectors or these big long tube refractors, but he understood that while most amateur astronomers live in the city or suburbs, most of the stars are out there in the rural country. And so he wanted to make something convenient and portable for us to bring. A large aperture, but convenient. And that was the Celestron 8, certainly. $850 with the orange tube. Today, $6,491. So, what kind of a Schmidt-Cassegrain could you get for almost $6,500 today? Could you get just a basic C8 with just a right ascension drive? Or you could get something a little bit more, a little bit fancier. Celestron really caught Criterion off guard, and Criterion scrambled because they saw the sales of their RV6 and RV8 that just, boom, like a rock down it went. And so they introduced the Dynamax 8 for $50 less, $795 versus $850. And they included a variable frequency drive corrector as well. Okay. Anybody on one of those, by the way? One of these? Okay. Wait, did you have one also? I want to know. What'd you think of it? Optically, it was awful. Yeah. I don't want to. Yours? How was that?
I just kept the tripod.
Okay. Now, yeah. Okay. The tripod was great, right? Yeah. Yeah. You paid for the tripod, and they threw the scope in for free. The optics were because it was rushed. It was not well thought out. The optics were poor, and the fork mount. It was a new kind of design. It was called a tuning fork mount because it would vibrate like this. So you just breathe on it, it would start to vibrate. It was rough, and that was really the death throes of Criterion. Eventually, they were bought out by Bosch and Lohm. Yeah, Scott.
Yeah, our club had one. We had a Dynamax 6, but when I was living near Hartford, we went to Church Street and saw them making these, and they were making the corrector plates out of plate window glass.
Really?
And he was stamping or cutting them out with like a cookie cutter, and then throwing them in and milling them out to shape. But it wasn't. I don't think the corrector plate glass was the same as Celestron was using.
No, probably not. No, I'm sure they were different than Celestron. Yeah. But I went to get my RV8. I picked it up at 331 Church Street also, and it wasn't too many years later that the whole area was condemned, and how they were putting out those. So they moved eventually to West Hartford, of course. But how they built the decent RV6s and 8s in that building is just beyond me, but they did. Another company did their homework a little bit better. Meade came along. Now, Meade started simply by importing instruments primarily from Japan at the time, like this little refractor that you see here, the Model 300, I think it was. And they were also starting to introduce some accessories, eyepieces, finder scopes, and so on. And so that was their niche, at least for the moment, because they didn't rush a product. Okay? We see what happens some years down the road when of course, they introduced the 2080. Here's an interesting company, Essential Optics. Anybody ever hear of them, Essential Optics? They were the Dobsonian philosophy before the Dobsonian mount was well known. Okay? They put all the money, they reasoned, correctly so, that they wanted to put all the money, all your money that you're buying it, into the optics to get as large an aperture as possible, and we're simply going to cobble together some sort of a mount that holds those things up to look at the sky. That's really essentially what a Dobsonian is, right? Because the original Dobsonian mounts is plywood and what have you. And so that's what they have here. But instead of a Dobsonian mount, they used a pipe mount. Now, a friend of mine who's often here, and I don't think he's here this year, so I could say it. If he was here, I wouldn't. But it was a pipe mount. It turned in right ascension, declination, and in about 3 other directions that you couldn't possibly predict because the threads kept unthreading themselves, loosening up. So it was going all over the place. But that was the essential optics. You could get a 12.5 inch for $529. That was cheaper than an 8 inch at the time. So that was attractive, certainly. Unfortunately, again, it didn't really hold water much. Another shot was taken at now Questar with the Quantum, Quantum from Optical Techniques, Newton, Pennsylvania. They were very good. They had a 4-inch aperture, very, very good. Yeah, they were terrific optics, right? Excellent telescope.
They were made by the same company that made the optics for Questar.
Oh, is that right? You said made by the optics here made by the same company as the optics for Questar, which explains why it was such a good scope. It's slightly different. You're right. Slightly different design. Yeah, but unfortunately, that didn't catch on. But it was a very, very good telescope.
Well, they made a 6 also.
They made a 6 too. That's right. Yeah, they did make a 6 also. Speaking of Stellafane, 1972, Norman James from California, I believe, right? California. He brought this ball mount telescope. That was fascinating. It literally rode on a bath of water and oil, I guess, in the base, and there was a suction cup that attached to it that would actually track the sky. Amazing telescope. These 2 pictures taken by Richard Sanderson over here. Take a look at the left-hand picture. If you look not just at the telescope, but a little bit behind it. Oh, there I am. What do you know? So proof positive I was there in 1972. Does that telescope, the shape, look familiar to anybody? It's a shame he didn't patent it because he was, well, they say imitation is a serious form of flattery. Yeah, maybe not so much. But so Edmund took that and ran with it with the Astroscan. Magazines started to come along. Other magazines started to come along in the 70s. In fact, the 1970s is really the decade of the magazine. Some were here to last, like astronomy. Others sort of came and went under a flurry of legal actions with Star and Sky. But astronomy, like I say, stayed till the end. We had Deep Sky magazine come along, Deep Sky Monthly, started by a high school kid in Oxford, Ohio named Dave Eicher. I wonder whatever happened to him. But we have that. Telescope making, the brilliance of Richard Berry, who was the editor of Astronomy magazine at the time. A quick story about Richard. Remember that picture I took of the club that I was in Stanford back then? 10 years before I was around, before Al and I were around in there, he was the president of that club. And in fact, editor of their newsletter called the Star Monthly. And then 10 years later, we put out Comic Courier, it was called, but the same basic concept. So it's just funny how our lives paralleled a decade separate, and we've exchanged copies of our newsletters since. Into the 80s we go, there we are, and Meade comes along. Now, unlike Criterion, they did their homework, and they produced, as it says over here, the Meade System 2000. Ooh. Very exciting. Meade System 2000. Well, Celestron took notice of this, and they pulled out the troops in terms of advertising. Okay? When I explore the real universe, I use precision optics from Celestron. Okay, so Celestron didn't take that lightly. But from the amateur point of view, the Dobsonian revolution was on the horizon. Right? John Dobson. Okay? Brilliant man when it came to looking at how to make things as simple as possible. Okay, that's what he did. He invented, although he hated the word invented, he apparently hated being credited with this telescope, and he didn't like it being called the Dobsonian telescope at all, even though that's an early one from up here at Stellafane. Here's what he said. He disagreed with the name, saying that for hundreds of years, wars were fought using cannons on Dobsonian mounts. That's a quote from an article I read of his. So that's interesting. So he actually preferred to call them sidewalk telescopes, because that's what he used them for, and that makes sense, right? Sidewalk telescopes. So maybe that's what we should be calling them. They were made lightweight mirrors, porthole glass, were the mirror blanks that he used, and he cobbled together these really crude mounts. I mean, by most people I think would say that. Plywood, a little bit of Teflon here and other low-cost stuff to make them. Plumbing fixtures maybe, even for the altitude axis and so on. But that really caught on when Coulter Optical, which was an optics maker, mirror maker, primarily in California, introduced the Odyssey 1. That was, you couldn't get those for over a year if you tried to order. You could get a 13-inch telescope for $400, $395. Again, you couldn't get an 8-inch for that. All of a sudden, you could get a 13-inch. Anybody own one of those? A Coulter? They weighed a ton, didn't they? Holy cow. The second version was with the red tube versus the blue here. The second version was better, yeah. But that was really the first commercial Dobsonian, I'll break the rule and say it, Dobsonian telescope, first commercial one. Others, like Orion telescopes, they were a new kid on the block, tried to counter for about $400. I could get this 8-inch, yeah, but for $400 I could also get a 6-inch on an equatorial mountain, so that didn't really catch on. They didn't have the price point. And if you want to talk about a telescope that didn't catch on, I love the Voxscope. Okay, the Voxscope by Astroscopics for only, where's my price? I don't even see a price here. I guess not. Maybe it is, I'm not seeing it. Oh, there it is right over there. Okay, yeah, $1,785. Okay. Well, okay, it looks like they use rebar of some sort for the altitude, and I'm not too sure, but why not? Because, like I say, it never really caught on, the Voxscope. But apochromats, also really great technology coming along into the 80s now, where you had astronomics, where you had Takahashi, and of course Al Nagler is credited with so much, rightfully so, for really reinventing that whole segment of the market with apochromatic telescopes. Conventions also caught on. Texas Star Party was born. Winter Star Party down the Florida Keys was born, but really the granddaddy of them all still had to be Stellafane. Everything was compared to Stellafane, and it continues to be even to this day. Eyepieces always were the forgotten part of the puzzle. Hey, you pick up a Ramsden eyepiece, you pick up a Kellner eyepiece. If you want to get the best, you get an orthoscopic eyepiece. Yikes. Okay, but that's what you did. But then, again, Plassos. Now, Plassos back then, they were made by a company called Clave over in France. And they were mysterious. They didn't really advertise, but you heard about all these mythical eyepieces called Clave Plassos until Al Nagler came along with Teleview and started to introduce a whole line of them. That was really the beginning. Okay? Beginning with a 26 millimeter down to a 7.4 millimeter, $45 each. Okay? That was on my Christmas list in 1981 when they first came out. Well, then, of course, things started to grow, and the Nagler line introduced. I love this. You can't really see it, but really tiny print. Let me walk over to it. Here he is. Here Al is leaning against the Nagler, and here in tiny print says, shown actual size. So I like that. That's great. That's great. So all of a sudden, eyepieces, the forgotten part of the puzzle, start to get a lot of attention. If you were into astrophotography back in the 80s, you were into hypersensitization. And so you got your Ektachrome 400, or you got your Tri-X, or you got whatever it was, and you put in these chambers, and you juice the film, for lack of a better term, and then you'd start taking pictures. Automation started to catch on a little bit. Roger Tuthill introduced the Celestial Navigator over here. The first idea of computerized setting circles. Ultimately will lead to the go-to scopes, of course, that we know so well today. Into the 90s, and we have the Celestron advertisements that adorn the page. You couldn't get away with that today, okay, but that's how Celestron approached things. Meade had now really state-of-the-art stuff coming out with the LX200. That really changed the game a lot also for Meade, was the LX200 series. Something else that changed the game for them, the ETX. The Questar cost you a fortune, right? But here, I can get an ETX for $500. Now, admittedly, you can't compare the mechanics of a Questar to an ETX, but the optics were top-notch in the ETX. So whatever they did with that, they did it really well with the optics, certainly. The Dobsonian design was also changing. Dobsonian Revolution Part 2, or Rev 2, with the Obsession and Dave Kriege, amateur telescope maker, who again started to market these things. In fact, I think instead of calling it the Dobsonian telescope, we should call it the Krugerian telescope, because that was his brainchild, was this idea of the open tube and the very large, he's a dentist, was a dentist by profession, I assume he's retired by now, but he really set the bar very high for other companies to try to come along with these portable designs that you could collapse. Digital astronomy, photography also caught on. Hypersensitization kind of went the way of the buffalo, and all of a sudden now we had that. And you could build your own, again, through the brainchild of Richard Berry, primarily. He introduced the CCD camera cookbook, that you could make your own digital camera. So anybody make one of those? So not for the faint of heart to make one, certainly, but they work very, very well for the technology of the day. And of course, you still have some of the gratuitous ads, which I just love. You're looking the wrong way, but you have an eyeball coming off that spacecraft. And anyway, but that's a cigarette ad. What can I tell you? Anyway, that's just a really quick look at the amateur telescope as it evolved over the 20th century to where we are today. We've come a long way, certainly, from the early 1900s. We've come a long way from even 10 years ago at the dawn of 20 years ago at the dawn of the century. But no matter how far we've come along, no matter how advanced we get, we must never lose touch with the real universe. That's critical. And if you can see the caption, which I copied out of the New Yorker magazine, the caption reads, "Just checking." He has the big telescope, radio telescope, he has a little spyglass he's looking at the nighttime sky. And that's about it. Thank you very much. Thank you. I should add, if you like looking at these old advertisements, which I just love, I've actually gathered a few and broken all kinds of copyright laws to post them on my website. So if you go to philharrington.net, just look for Nights of Future Past. I've divided them up by decades, and you can see them. So it's kind of a fun thing to do. And I keep adding them as some people send them to me, and I just grab them on my own. But if you go there, again, look for Nights of Future Past. There's a link from the homepage, and you'll get over that by decade. So that's kind of fun. Questions, anything at all from anyone? Anybody want to reflect on anything? Yes, sir.
Did you check Sarah Schechter's talk at the Harden?
I did not, unfortunately.
She was talking and showing a lot of advertisements for other products
Uh-huh.
and with astronomical theme, whether Phaco, telescopes, planets, or comets.
Things like that. Yeah.
You get together with
I was going to say we could trade notes back and forth. Yeah, really interesting. Very interesting. Anything else at all? I just want to put in a quick plug for the Binocular Observing Olympics, number 3. Coming up, I put together a whole new list of stuff this year. I caught 4 of them already last night. And man, there was one I put in. I'm really regretting I chose it now because I don't think I could see it. But anyway, I'm going to try anyway. But there are 20 of them. I saw Eileen has it all set up in the observing field already. So if you don't have a copy of the list and the charts and such that I created for it, by all means grab one up there and have a go for it. Okay, good luck. We got a great night tonight, I'm hoping, and even better night tomorrow night, so we have more than ample time to knock off all 20 of them. So, okay, terrific. Thank you very much, everybody.